Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. And with me today to share the 10 best spiritual books that inspired him the most on his life journey is Joseph Selbie. An avid follower of the unfolding new paradigms of science, he's known for creating bridges of understanding between the modern evidence-based discoveries of science and the ancient experience-based discoveries of the mystics. A founding member of Ananda, a worldwide spiritual movement inspired by Paramahansa Yogananda, and a dedicated kriya meditator for nearly 50 years, Joseph has taught yoga and meditation throughout the US and Europe, and he's helped hundreds of people awaken to their own spiritual potentials. He's also the author of several books himself, including the Protectors Diaries, a sci-fi fantasy series inspired by the abilities of mystics, the Yugas, keys to understanding our hidden past, emerging energy age and enlightened future, and the physics of God, and his latest release, Break Through the Limits of the Brain. Joseph Selbie, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for contributing your 10 best books to the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Now, I know that you love books, and you've said that you never tire of the endlessly varied mental, emotional, inspirational, and especially transformational journeys on which books have taken you. So tell me, what criteria did you use to create your 10 best list?
Well, some of them were just a emotional uplift. Some of them were just fascinating, but spiritually uplifting. And then many of them were to the heart of what has become my life, which is the path of Paramahansa Yogananda and the books that he wrote and that are supported by others who experienced his life.
So did you construct your list in chronological order of how they came into your life, or, favorite or not?
I wasn't thinking chronologically, but they probably are close. The 10 are probably close to chronological order. But mainly I just cast my mind back, and I've read thousands of books, as you probably have as well. And I just kind of let the ones that had really stood out surface and gradually winnowed a list down to 10 from them.
Well, it's no surprise that the very first one on your list is Autobiography of a Yogi. And you may not be surprised to hear that this one comes up again and again and again on people's lists.
Yes, not at all surprised. I interviewed Phil Goldberg about the Autobiography of a Yogi, which Yogananda wrote in 1946. And Phil Goldberg had interviewed, he said, up to 200 contemporary spiritual teachers. And he said the one book that they all said had been influential in their, coming to their own spiritual paths and their own spiritual insights that eventually led them to be teachers in their own right, was the Autobiography of a Yogi. It has been a tremendously influential book in the 20th and now 21st century. There's something like 30 million copies have been sold, and it's been published now in nearly 40 different languages around the world. So it is indeed it's like an uber spiritual book for this last 150 years.
Mm. So, I mean, it was published in 1946. Why do you think this book has made such a big impact on people?
Well, the number of things. One is that it's a rare first-person account of spiritual experiences by a obviously very highly advanced spiritual master. And it's not written like a scripture, which is meant to be kind of memorized and has shlokas or phrases. It's really a narrative, which is unusual again, but it's a narrative style that is very easy for Westerners to embrace. I think also what particularly touches me, because as you mentioned at the beginning here, that I've written several books that are focused on science and spirituality and where they intersect. Yogananda is, to my knowledge, one of the first spiritual teachers to address those connections. And he devotes an entire chapter called the Law of Miracles, where he brings in Einstein's theory of relativity and connects it to how masters can do miracles. So those little nuggets that he put in there are ones that I have used. But I also think many, many people have noticed that he weaves in not only Western science, but the Western vernacular. He really wrote this for Westerners. He wrote this to be a book that was accessible to the Western mind and embraceable by people who are steeped in Western science and Western outlook. But among all that, he tells these tremendously moving, amazing stories of his own spiritual experiences and the experiential experiences of other masters that he encountered in his life. So it's a tour de force, really, of readability, accessibility, enjoyment, and then profound spiritual teaching.
Mm. So tell me, when and how did it come into your life? And we know it had a big impact on you, but what can you tell us about that impact?
I first started reading it probably in my freshman year of college. So I was probably still 18, 19, right in there. And the timing was perfect. I had read some other spiritual books that sort of hinted at deeper truths that I might be interested in. But when I read that one, it was like coming home. It was this amazing experience. And in many ways, it started me in a step-by-step process that led me to becoming a part of Ananda and making these teachings that he refers to. It's not just in the book, the autobiography, but the deeper teachings of yoga and the techniques of yoga became really the mainstay of my life from there forward.
So, did somebody recommend the book to you, or was it a natural follow-on after the previous book that you'd read?
Well, as these things often happen, I just by random chance ended up with a roommate in my college dormitory who knew about the autobiography of a yogi, and I think he actually handed me the first copy that I read. So that made me a firm believer that there are no accidents, that everything comes along at the right time from somewhere around you, that you may never even know that such a thing that you needed existed, and then it comes into your life, often through other people.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, the messengers. Yeah. So you said that it was obviously had a profound effect on you, and it was like coming home. Did you immediately say, "I've got to have more of this"?
Yes, and there was more to be had. At the time, I started taking a course that was sent to me in weekly lessons for a long period of time, which really gave me more of the foundation of practices that I could put to work. But yeah, it definitely led to more right away. And he has other books, Yogananda has other books that he wrote that I can't necessarily pick out one that's more influential than the other, but I read them all. I just consumed them all in a very short period of time.
Now,
And
this
then
was
when I
at
got
a
to
time.
Ananda, I discovered another trove, which is speaks to the second book on my list. The joy for me of coming to Ananda was that Ananda was founded and inspired by and enlivened every day by Swami Kriyananda, who was a direct disciple of Yogananda's. So by the time I had the book in hand in 1971, Yogananda was long past. He died in 1952. So for me, connecting to Swami Kriyananda was this living connection to Yogananda. And he had been with Yogananda himself for many years, and then in the organization that Yogananda started, and could tell many, many stories about his time with Yogananda, and particularly in The New Path, which was, I think, the book that Kriyananda put the most care and depth in of any of the books that he wrote. Not that I wouldn't unhesitatingly recommend any book that Kriyananda wrote. This one stood out because he took the better part of 2 or 3 years to write it and lovingly edited it until it was exactly what he wanted it to be. Because he was telling, in a way, he was a biographer of Yogananda, even though Kriyananda is the thing that ties together everything that's in The New Path. It's really a biography of Yogananda in that period of time, and to understand how he worked with his students, which you don't necessarily get through the autobiography. So it brought him alive. It focused me as a student, disciple of Yogananda in a very rich way.
Now, this was at a time when you were studying science at college.
Well, by the time I got to Ananda, I had finished with college. So it was in between that discovery of Yogananda through the autobiography of a yogi, and when I finally made it to Ananda, that I finished those years of studying in college.
So that really changed your entire direction.
Yes, it changed my entire life. Now, many people would be likely to think that therefore I became like a monk or I became cloistered, but I really fell into a life at Ananda of a very rich and active and outward life. I did many things, managed businesses, started a business that did web development, traveled extensively. And so it expanded me, it awakened me to many, many potentials that I had. But all the while, it deepened my life as a student and disciple of Yogananda. So they're not mutually exclusive by any means. And in fact, in some ways, Yogananda said that a dynamic life is better for developing your spiritual life than a more passive, quiet life.
Yeah.
We need challenges. The way he put it is that you become stronger if you wrestle strong opponents. So you need those challenges in your life to develop the abilities that will then be useful to you to dive deeper into meditation and to take your spiritual life more seriously as well.
So The New Path by Swami Kriyananda, that one has been lauded, hasn't it, as a stunning sequel or companion book to Yogananda's autobiography. And Kriya Yogananda was a young American when he started his spiritual quest.
Yes, he was only, I think, 22 when he came to meet Yogananda in person after himself reading the autobiography of a yogi. As he tells it, he read the autobiography of a yogi, and 4 days later, he was on a train from New York to LA. And in days after that, he became a disciple of Yogananda's and lived in his ashram there in LA for many, many years. So it similarly galvanized and transformed Kriyananda as it did me.
Yeah. Book number 3 on your list is The Flawless Mirror by Kamala Silver, which was published in 1993. Tell us about that book.
Well, now this book is less well known, I think, probably than either the autobiography, but less well known even than the New Path might be. It was written by a disciple of Yogananda's who never really spent that much time in his ashram, although she did spend some time. But nonetheless, she had all these profound spiritual experiences in her meditations that connected to Yogananda. Yogananda came to her in her meditations, and other teachers that are a part of Yogananda's spiritual lineage came to her. And so it was fascinating to see not only what those experiences were like, which were more inspirational than fascinating, perhaps, but also a bit fascinating. She always wanted to see the eyes of one of the line of teachers that is part of Yogananda's path, because all the pictures of him, his eyes were almost shut. And she always wanted to see his eyes. And it wasn't, something that she necessarily thought about a lot, but it was something she had thought about. And in a vision, he came to her with his eyes fully open and took her on a sort of dance-like tour of the astral regions. And then she came back to her body, and that particular vision and experience was gone. But she had really profound, deep experiences that just moved me and entranced me. But I was also fascinated by the fact that she had a atypical relationship to Yogananda, and yet she had these powerful experiences. And that sort of cemented for me, perhaps, the reality is that we're all on our own path, that none of us are going to even outwardly look like we're walking the same footsteps as anyone else, that we all are unique. We all have unique lessons to learn. We all have unique experiences, and that is just the reality. Many people, I think, make a mistake of thinking that if you choose a particular path, you're locking yourself into a certain set of behaviors, and that there's a level of conformity required in order for that spiritual teaching to be successful for you. And I really don't think it's true. I mean, perhaps the only thing you conform in any of these spiritual paths that people walk and embrace is your commitment to it. And you're just making it a focus of your life. And then how your life unfolds is just, everybody's different. I have literally hundreds of friends who have been walking this path with me, and every one of them are different. And every one of the things that they've done in their lives is different from anything that I have done. So I know that it is a reality in all spiritual teachings. And Yogananda also, perhaps more than other teachers of his time, did not discourage people from being in relationships and being married, and even said that lived rightly, that a marriage could be more empowering to your spiritual growth and development than not being married. So he actually encouraged Kamala in somewhere in her life to get married. And so I have found that to be a powerful thing. Is not only is it okay for people who are strongly drawn to spiritual teachings, to a life of meditation, to a life of seeking God, not only is it okay to be married, it can be a real uplifting benefit, and that you should embrace it as part of your path and part of your unique life's unfoldment, because you can learn so much in intimate relationships, but all your relationships, but particularly the close, intimate relationships, because that's where you have to work, right? That's where you have to work the most. You know, you can leave your work colleagues at the end of the day, and you have that freedom to maybe not fully commit to the level of a relationship with your friends that you would to a life companion. And that's where you really can learn. And it can be wonderful. I find that it has taught me a lot more about how to love than perhaps any other relationship could have taught me.
Yeah.
And that I highly value those lessons of learning to love.
Yeah. I think Marianne Williamson may have been her who said, you know, your relationship is where you meet yourself.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So book number 4 is The Holy Science by Swami Sri Yukteswar, which was published in 1894.
Yes.
And he was a teacher of Yogananda, was he not?
Right. Now this is in my list for a couple of reasons. One is the book itself is an extremely comprehensive description of, you know, how we incarnated and how we got to where we are today and how to get beyond where we are today. But it is extremely dense. It's not for everybody unless you are kind of willing to read it as a scripture rather than a narrative. It's deep, it's profound, and I have read it many times and don't pretend to understand it even in the last time I read it, because there's a lot there and he packs a lot in. But the main reason I put it in my list is because it had a surpassing influence on my understanding of what had been my some of my college study, which was in Greek history, Greek philosophy, and then Indian history and Indian philosophy, was that there is a cyclic history theory that comes to us from India, and Sri Yukteswar was an exponent of it, and it's called the Yugas. And I ended up writing a book called The Yugas, based on what is really 10 pages worth of information. It's really very little, but it gives the essence of this whole cycle. And that inspired me to go out with my background in ancient history and ancient philosophy to look at what the archaeological footprint is around the world. And I found amazing connections to the notion that there were higher ages in the past. And then from that, I could look forward into the future and see how higher ages might unfold, which is the meat of the book on the Yugas. So he was a very powerful influence in that sense, that he inspired me to learn more and go deeper into this view of history, this view of the development of civilization. And I love it.
I want to talk about the Yugas a bit later because it sounds quite fascinating to me. But I'm going to shut the door. Before I do, I'm going to ask you about the next book, which is Saints That Moved the World, Anthony Augustine, Francis Ignatius and Teresa by Renee Fulop Miller, published in 2010. Saints that moved the world. I thought all saints moved the world. Please start talking. I am just going to go off camera so I can shut the door.
Okay. Well, this book, although it says it's published in 2010, that's actually a republishing of it. I think it was actually originally published probably in the 60s or 70s, maybe even earlier. And the man had a knack, Rene Philip Miller had a knack for conveying the essence and power of the lives of these well-known saints. But he also explained how what they did influenced the way the world worked. And so it's both of those. Now, my personal interest was more in the essence of how those saints lived their lives. And again, they lived them all differently, but he brought them to life in a personal way. So let me just give you one example. He tells a story of Saint Teresa, who by this time in her life, when the story is told, had become a very influential nun in the Catholic world. She'd founded several convents, and she traveled a lot as a result. But she was very deeply connected to Jesus. She felt his presence. She felt him, with her all the time. She talked to him constantly. And there was a moment where she was crossing a river, and I don't know what caused it to happen. Maybe her horse stumbled and fell or whatever, but she got dunked. She got completely immersed, had to be, rescued and dragged out of the water. And then she said to Jesus something about, "Is this the way you treat all your friends?" And he said, "Yes, of course, this is the way I treat all my friends. This is the way they grow." So there was an intimate exchange between her guru, Jesus, and her experience. And I just loved that tiny little story in a broader life, because it brought home to me that it's possible for any of us, if we choose to have that kind of personal connection to God in whatever form draws us. So the other recountings of other tales in the life of these great saints were equally personal and well penned. So I don't even know I could tell you what the effects they had on the world were as he, delineated them in the book. But I remember many of the stories and the shape of the lives of these saints.
So there was a comment I saw on a website about the book that, there's 25,000 saints recognized by the church. He chose 5. Do you know why he chose those 5?
Well, that kind of goes back to what I'm not sure I could remember well enough to tell you. But he chose these because he felt that they had a societal impact, that they actually influenced what we might think of as secular society. Right. Augustine is perhaps the easiest one for me to give an example, because Augustine was considered not only to be a saint, but he was also considered to be a philosopher, and that he brought forward the ancient teachings of Plato that had pretty much been lost in time, and he brought them back and put them into the Catholic canon. But it also became kind of a foundation of Western philosophy as well as Western theology. So in that sense, he influenced society and civilization significantly by bringing back people's awareness of the ancient Greek philosophers that had been completely lost. And then Aquinas, who followed after him, actually brought back the teachings of Aristotle. So those were the kind of things that he found to be true in the lives of those saints. that they had an impact beyond being saints, if you will.
Yeah. Well, book number 6 on your list is quite different. It's Kinship with All Life by J. Allen Boone, published in 1954. And it's about a man who had a spiritual relationship with the first actor dog. So tell us about this one and how it moved you.
It's a delightful book. J. Allen Boone was, for all of his life, fascinated by animals of all kinds, from insects to monkeys. And his life was really, a way of getting his time with animals. So he became a dog trainer as one of those things. But he really loved all animals. But this was a practical way to do it. And that led him to being asked to take care of Strongheart. And Strongheart was the original German Shepherd dog who acted in Hollywood movies. And his successor is probably better known, which was Rin Tin Tin. And then, of course, we know about Lassie and a whole bunch of others. But Strongheart was the first one. And Strongheart became successful because he was so intelligent and could follow just about anything that he was asked to do and do it on camera, on cue. But there was more to Strongheart than being a well-trained animal. And he actually lived with J. Allen Boone, or vice versa. And J. Allen Boone was with him 24 hours a day, essentially, for many, many years. And he found that Strongheart had a very strong will and could convey to him what he needed J. Allen Boone to do for him, not the other way around. There was a time, one story stood out for me early on, where J. Allen Boone and Strongheart were sharing a bed. So Boone arranged the bed so that the head of the bed was opposite a window in the room. And every time there was a noise outside, Strongheart, because he was trained as a guard dog, would jump out of bed. And in the process, he would basically push J. Allen Boone off the bed onto the floor on the opposite side of the bed. And he kept telling Strongheart, don't do this. And he kept doing it. Every time he heard a sound, he'd push him off onto the floor, and they would start all over. And so finally, J. Allen Boone just looked at him, and Strongheart looked back, and he said, I need you to stop doing that. And Strongheart went over to the window, grabbed the curtain in his teeth, pulled the curtain back, looked out the window, looked at Boone. And then Boone got it, and he turned the bed around so that Strongheart didn't have to leap off the bed every time to go investigate what was going on. Now, this may have seemed like Boone was slow on the uptake, but Strongheart knew what he needed to do. He was a guard dog. He needed to have his nose and his ears near to the window. So there were many examples of this. Another one that was a fun one was that they traded walks. They traded where they were going on walks every morning. So one day, J. Allen Boone would go where he wanted to go, and Strongheart would follow. The next day, Strongheart would lead, and he would follow. But he gradually sensed that there was a lot more to Strongheart than being a very intelligent dog. And he had this moment on a hilltop where he realized that this was not God manifesting a dog. This was a God manifesting as a dog. And that God was just as much in Strongheart as God was anywhere else. And when he had this moment of, intuition and realization, Strongheart turned his head and looked right at him. And J. Allen Boone actually wrote, after Strongheart left his world, no longer needed as a trainer, he wrote letters to Strongheart for the rest of his life and felt that he received intuitive answers in his moments of reflection, and that he had this deep spiritual relationship with Strongheart as a spiritual being. There are other stories in there that are fun, interesting, comical, meaningful. I really recommend anybody read it if you are delighted in animals and the connections, the depth of connection we can have with animals. But it was just one more example for me of how our spiritual lives unfold in so many different ways.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned that there was one called Freddie the Fly. Did he
Yes,
communicate with Freddie?
Freddie the Fly, he was somewhere, I forget exactly the context, but I think he was in a cabin somewhere. And this fly kept landing on him. And he would, as we all do, he'd shake him off and the fly would come back. But he didn't want to swat it. He didn't want to kill any animal. He was very attuned to all animals in all aspects of nature. And Freddie landed on his arm once again. And he held up his arm and he looked at Freddie and he said, "The reason I'm shaking my arm is because humans don't like insects crawling on them. They don't like the sensation on their skin." And he shook him off again. And then Freddie landed on his shirt and always landed on his shirt. And he had days of this relationship with Freddie, and Freddie would always land on his clothing and not on his skin. So a remarkable man, remarkable stories about the interconnection of all life, as the title suggests.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So book number 7 is The Spiritual Journey of Joseph L. Greenstein, The Mighty Atom by Ed Spielman, published in 1979. And this is a story of one of the world's greatest strongmen. Yeah,
there was an era, the first part of the 20th century, in carnivals and in bigger shows where you had, the mighty feats of people who could lift things, and it was very popular. There were competing. You had to have a name that wasn't anybody else's name, sort of like rappers today. They all have different names, but then there were literally hundreds of them. But the mighty atom stood out because he was so small, and yet he could do these amazing feats of bending metal. And he could take an ordinary horseshoe, and horseshoes are made of steel or iron. They're incredibly strong. And he could, grab one end of one side and the other end of the other and just bend it open with just the strength of his body. And he was often accused of, having weak horseshoes that were already, weakened by some means, and therefore they would have been easy to bend. But he would freely let anybody give him a horseshoe that came to see him, and he would bend those, even the strongest. He could bend iron bars, rods of steel. He could bend them in a circle. He could do things with his teeth that were astonishing, where he could, bite metal in his mouth and then bend it down around his jaw. So these were all his acts, right? They were just done to get people's attention. But underneath it all, the mighty atom, Joseph Greenstein, was on a spiritual path, and that he learned from another kind of strong man who was kind of befriended him in Europe. And he was a skinny little thing, went to work for this strong man, learned his, how you act and how you get people's attention. But he also bulked up and became really strong But mainly he learned that there was a mental component to the whole thing that was far more important than any kind of muscular strength you could bring to it. And he got into the Kabbalah, and he got into esoteric spiritual teachings that led him to understand that he could channel and use life force to do these more and more incredible feats. And that every time he did it, for him, it was a spiritual experience because he brought his entire focus of his being, and therefore all of his life force was flowing through him until he felt like an electric current passing over his being. And then he would do whatever that feat was, and he would experience it. And so when he was at fairs and things, he would first show the incredible feats, but then he would teach people how he did it. And he would encourage them to learn these amazing esoteric practices so that they could have that experience of life force themselves. And he tied it all back to God. There was no question in his mind that life force was coming from the divine. So it was a great read, fascinating story, but with this, again, yet another example of the many, many ways that people seek and find God.
Wow, very interesting. So number 8, The Tao of Physics, an exploration of the parallels between modern physics and Eastern mysticism, by the Austrian-born American physicist Fritjof Capra. And that was published in 1975, I think. And you said that this is the book that inspired you to write your first book.
Yeah, it was the first of its kind that I read, but it remained with me as a source of inspiration. I read it probably right around when it came out, 1975, maybe a little later. And I didn't write The Physics of God until 2017, so a long time in between, but it was always there, always had a prominent place on my shelf. And he did a very good job, I always felt, a very good job of tying together the more subtle, tending to be mentally confounding teachings of Buddhism with the more confounding aspects of quantum physics. And he showed how, they were talking about the same thing and both saying you can't understand this with the mind per se. It comes back to deeper experiential realities of science. So I loved that, and it inspired me. Since then, I've read 20, 30 other books of its ilk that, in a way, built on that. And in a way, that all built on, as I'd said to begin with, on Yogananda's expression, sharing that connection between science and spirituality. So for me, I can kind of draw a line through books from my 2017 Physics of God all the way back to the Autobiography of a Yogi.
Yeah. Well, number 9 is different again. And you said that there's no description needed. There can't be anybody who doesn't know about this book. It is The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, published in 1954. This has come up a few times, inspired so many people. Yeah,
well, I love fantasy and science fiction to some degree, but sci-fi fantasy or fantasy, as long as it has a fantasy element in it, because it's one of the only genres where noble characters are the expectation. And now that there's been so much fantasy written, there's starting to be, divisions within the genre. And what I refer to is really more often called high fantasy than just fantasy in general. But I was inspired by self-sacrifice. I'm still inspired by self-sacrifice. I read other books that aren't fantasy, and yet I've noticed there is a theme the books I like certain detective characters, but I always like their samurai. So samurai live for the righteousness of what they're doing, and even though they've honed themselves to being these deadly warriors, they can also end up coming out of some kind of encounter, and there's a child without a parent as a result of whatever happened, and they take the child and they raise it as their own, because they don't see any separation between what it is to be a warrior and what it is to do the right thing. So the detective books that I tend to like have those kind of characters, that they may be, badasses, but they're noble in their willingness to self-sacrifice, and they end up not doing it for the money, not doing it even if their client wants them to do it anymore. They want to do it to see the right thing happen. So all of that is a big digression from the self-sacrifice and nobility that you find in characters in Tolkien. I just loved, and I realized after decades of, I've read the Lord of the Rings 10 times, maybe more. What always moves me is the moments of noble self-sacrifice, whether it's the warriors, whether it's the wizards. Those are the moments that move me and still move me. I watched the Peter Jackson movie of the Lord of the Rings just the other day, and I watched the third installment, the third movie, and that moment when Eowyn kills the evil ring wraith, the head of the ring wraiths. I mean, I almost cry every time in that, because she's just giving it her all. She doesn't know if she's going to live or die, and of course she does live and she does kill it. But I think that feeling of self-sacrifice is harder and harder to find in our society, and I wish it would make a comeback. I wish that people would see self-sacrifice as a necessary part of their own journey, but also of just, it's the fabric of society, is to give more than you get, or at least to start with giving more than you think you can get out of it, and to care for people, to take the time to be with people. I remember.
Well, it speaks of honor, doesn't it? It speaks of honor, and it speaks of ethics, and it speaks of all the values that we value.
Yeah. So I love it and honor it, and in my books, it's a central feature of them. Although in my books, I try to bring out the spiritual side, the spiritual equation. In most high fantasy, it's just a given that, well, this guy's a wizard and this guy isn't, right? And there's no message in it that if you work at it, you too can become a wizard, right? There's no pathway to transcendence. And so I try to work that into my books, that it's all part of a pathway to transcendence. It's all part of a pathway to having those kind of extraordinary abilities.
Who is your favorite fantasy author?
Well, it has to be Tolkien. There's just none other that reached that height as well. I've read many, many others, and some of them are I'm trying to think of one to bring out in particular. Patricia McKillop, I like, because she's very heart-oriented, and she has lots of harpists and sort of people that she shrouds them, she surrounds them in mystic abilities, and the whole story is about them using their mystic abilities to counter negative influences that are happening. But it is very heartfelt. I like her, but I've read so many hundreds, it's difficult to pick out any more specific.
I'm a fantasy fan, and I love Robin Hobb. And in one of her trilogy of trilogies, 9 books, The Assassin's Apprentice, she had a really cool device where the princes, the kings, all had names that became their character. So they would be Prudence or Patience or, and they expressed those qualities throughout their life. And I thought that's really neat. That you could name someone. It's a bit like, the fairies giving you gifts, isn't it?
Right.
I'm going to give you patience, and you move through life with as much patience as you need.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So, book number 10, and again, you've thrown a bit of a curveball here. This one is completely different. It is the Golf Omnibus by P.G. Wodehouse. And this was published in 1966. And you said that this one was thrown in case you ended up on a desert island with only these books to read because it makes you laugh.
It makes me laugh uproariously. You, as a Brit, are probably familiar with P.G. Wodehouse, but not that many are necessarily, particularly in America. I got started reading him when I came to Ananda because Swami Kriyananda loved him, had read practically every one of his something like 300 books that P.G. Wodehouse wrote. And Kriyananda used to read the short stories to us at events like Thanksgiving or after a Christmas feast or something. And Kriyananda was very good at doing the different voices for different characters. And one of my particular favorite short story collections that he used to read from were the golf stories. And there was Mr. Mulliner stories, and this one, instead of having Mr. Mulliner as the person telling this story, they had the oldest member of the clubhouse, and the oldest member would relate some sage but goofy story that encapsulated people. P.G. Wodehouse is always about people and the foibles of people, and in a kind-hearted way, but it's in the context of people playing golf. And I play golf, and so I'm sure P.G. Wodehouse must have played golf to understand the nuances the way he did. But I've read every story in the Golf Omnibus many a time, and when I reread them, I still laugh out loud because he is such a good teller of the tales and getting these situations where the only way you can cope with them is just to laugh at them. So everybody needs a laugh. Laughter is, there is a laughter yoga, which I can appreciate. Many people have probably heard of it. You just go to wherever it's happening and you just start laughing, and everybody starts laughing, and you come out of it lighter and happier as a result. So it's good to laugh, especially in a time like today when the news seems grim always.
Yes. There used to be, I don't think it's still here, but in England, we used to have a laughter clinic at one of the hospitals. And that came out after probably about 20 years or more ago, when there was quite a bit of research about how laughter, releases all of the feel-good hormones and chemicals. And I think there was somebody who had cancer who did nothing but watch funny movies. And cured himself of cancer. And so there was a cancer clinic, a laughter clinic. Yeah, definitely good for your health. So you cheated.
I did.
You did.
Knowingly and with foresight. Yeah.
I know, without any shame.
No shame.
No shame. Normally that's, rap on the knuckles. But I'll let you very briefly, because I do want to give some time to talk about you and your books. Very briefly, just tell us, the books that you had to cheat for.
Well, I had a very hard time thinking of one near-death experience book that was my favorite. So I threw in 5. And I don't really need to go into them in any particular detail, but they were Life After Life by Raymond Moody, Embraced by the Light by Betty Eadie, Proof of Heaven, Eben Alexander, Dying to Be Me, Anita Morjani, Journey Through the Light and Back by Mellon Thomas Benedict. And I could go on. I love near-death experience stories and really have a great deal of respect for those people who, take the time to write books and share them with us. But the common theme in all of these and in scores of others is the matter-of-fact way they talk about life after death. And that, for me, it's so confirming. If you read a whole bunch of them, you begin to see that there are common themes that they all hit on. All of them have unique things that they share as well, but there are common themes. And those common themes are what the saints and sages tell us we're going to experience and that we can experience. So it's just so confirming and moving and inspirational. The overwhelming message that they all seem to share when they come back, especially if you get to watch them. You can't necessarily get the full experience when you just read their books, but you get a lot. But if you can watch them, they're so calm and they're so willing to share that loving experience that they had.
Yeah.
That it's just moving. They are sort of saints, each one. They're not all that saintly seeming, but they all have been touched by it in a way that they then have no question about leading their life in accordance with what they experienced.
Yeah, I've interviewed a lot of people, near-death experiences, and it's very inspirational, very. So let's move on to your books. You've published several books. You've published The Physics of God, your new book, Break Through the Limits of the Brain. You've written a sci-fi fantasy series. I had to smile because I think there was a piece that I was looking at today. I just happened across on Amazon, one of the books in the sci-fi fantasy series, The Protectors Diaries, which is inspired by the abilities of the mystics. And there was a little line in there about how these heroes, I suppose, were chasing somebody who was doing something really awful with the economy. And change, and I thought, wow, this is real life, isn't it? People doing awful things with the economy.
Yeah. Well, I was in every author's effort to get their books published. You usually have to get your books to fit into some sort of genre, so that a publisher could say, okay, this is that kind of book, I can sell it. Yeah. But there is no genre for my particular books, unfortunately. So I kept sort of searching for a name for them. And I copied what became the genre for the Harry Potter type books, which is magical realism. So I decided to call this spiritual realism. And the point being that it takes place in real life in a contemporary setting. And it's real spiritual abilities, as we are told by the mystics and the saints, that all of us can potentially learn to use. So that's what it became. So I had to fit it in. I wanted to fit it into some kind of contemporary issue. So the first one of the two that are available on Amazon, I focused on a villain who was trying to take over a new source of energy, the fifth force. And in the second one, I created a evil cabal of people who were had their fingers and tentacles into everything in the world that had to do with money and government, and were just about to have so much control that there was no going back. And then I have since rolled those two books together along with essentially a third book and put it into one book so that they all flow in sequence. And it hasn't been published yet. But the third one has to do with some kind of computer virus that could, if released in concert all over the world, could basically destroy the financial institutions of the entire world and leave us, fighting with each other. So there, I wanted to have a bad guy. I tried to avoid bad guys who were sort of nastily evil because it's so overused, I didn't want I don't want to fight him Sauron, who's, likes to dismember his minions. I didn't want just a filthily dark evil, but I wanted it to be things that could happen, and it could be something that people with extreme self-interested motives might do. And so there you have it.
The fantasy series is a wonderful illustration of the kinds of gifts and capacities and abilities that we can all develop that you write about in your book, Break Through the Limits of the Brain.
Yes. I mean, everything I do, I try to make it cohesive and that it really represents our potential.
Yeah. Well, before we close, tell us about the Yugas, because, the keys to understanding our hidden past, emerging energy age, and enlightened future. That sounds very promising, as though we're going to have an enlightened future. So tell us a bit about the Yugas.
Yes, but most people who read the Yugas actually do feel a lift that there is hope for a better tomorrow, because basically the idea of the Yugas that was put forward by Sri Yukteswar in his book, as already mentioned, is that there is a 24,000 year cycle that goes from the most highly advanced level to the least advanced and back again to the highly advanced level in 24,000 years. So according to Sri Yukteswar, we are on the upswing. We're not very close to the ultimate heights of human expression on the earth, but we're at least coming up from a very low age, which was kind of emblematic of the Dark Ages and the fall of Rome and the sacking of Rome and the Visigoths running rampant all over Europe. So that was the low point, according to Sri Yukteswar, and we're on the upswing. And he also delineates 4 different types of ages. So the lowest age that we just came out of, he refers to as the material age, or Kali Yuga. And then we're moving into Dwapara Yuga, which we're in now, which is an energy age. And there are 2 further ages beyond that go into mental abilities and finally into spiritual awareness at the height. So the good news for us is that we are in a upward movement of progress towards the ultimate. The bad news is that it's a time where self-interest dominates. So we have enlightened self-interest, which folks like yourself and myself see that, giving and caring for others is in my best interest because I'm going to help them and they're going to in turn help the world, and the world is bettered by everybody helping each other. But that it's not a logic that everybody gets. There is a logic that says, I keep for myself what I can because then I have it, right? And that's sort of the story of our age, and that causes people to have conflict with each other, because if you have it and I want it, I'm going to try to get it from you in a nutshell. But we are moving forward. And even though it's very hard to see, there are interesting studies done and books written that chronicle all the changes that have happened since, say, 1900 to today, that show we've made enormous strides forward in terms of societal norms and expectations and experiences. But they get buried now, that sort of perspective on things get buried by the 24-hour news cycle, which just deluges us in bad news and worse news and worse news. But we don't see some of that development, even though it's there.
So how many years to go until we're really in that enlightened cycle?
Well, don't hold your breath. It's a while. And in that 24,000 year period, we have another approximately 11,000 years to reach the pinnacle. But things do get progressively better. In even 1,000 more years, society will have advanced significantly. So, but we are where we are. We all come into our incarnations at the time we need to come into them. So I think always a good question to ask ourselves is what is my contribution to now? What can I give? You're, getting the truths, higher truths, heart-changing, mind-changing, world-changing truths out there every day. What do? I write books. What can somebody else do? All of us need to, be the change, to embody the change we want to see in the world. And that's how we're going to do it incrementally. And living that kind of life is always much more satisfying, regardless of what else is happening in the rest of the world. We get a lot more joy in our life if we give joy. That's the simple matter.
Well, all the studies show that generous people live healthier and longer. So yes, absolutely, it's in our interest. So, final question, Joseph: what are you reading now?
What am I reading now? That's a good question. What am I reading now? I just finished a impossibly long series. I have it hard to recommend it because I actually found myself skimming through vast wadges of this series. But I liked its core premise. It was based on the Horatio Hornblower series, but took it out to outer space. So instead of sailing ships, you had spaceships, but you still had the central character who echoes Horatio Hornblower, and you go through her career, her space naval career, in the same way that you go through Horatio's. And he starts off as a, cabin boy or midshipman or whatever it is. And each book that you wrote after that, he's up a rank and up a rank and up a rank. And the context of it is that humankind left the Earth, 1,000 years ago, and were spread all over a portion of the galaxy. And now they have space navy battles between all those places. And our main hero, Honor Harrington, with HH for her initials, is in the kingdom of Manticore. And you would probably enjoy it because there's so many British references in it. And there's Queen Elizabeth III is running the kingdom of Manticore and so forth. But it is really long. David Weber is the author, and it's known as the Harrington verse or the Honor Harrington series. But I liked it again because they're noble characters, and they're trying to be the essential warrior, the true soldier who lives their life to protect others and to take care of others, and they do a good job of it. And then there's just gobs of science fiction battles and spaceships mixed in that kept me going. But as I say, it's so long. David Weber is a prolific author and has other series, and he started in on this series. And the core number of books, if you just want to stay with Honor Harrington, is 15. But he got, I think, sort of uninterested in the main line of what he was writing, and he wrote these outgrowths that then come back into the main line. So if you really want to read them all, something like 25 books. And because you can't expect somebody to have already read them all, you can't begin just where the last one left off. You have to bring in all the characters, all the context, and so that's where I'm just skimming like mad, trying to get to something that is now new. But I did enjoy them. So that's what I read most recently. Sometimes I yearn for a new good author. I imagine you have that same feeling often. I've read my favorites, 5, 6, 8 times. They're like old friends I get to go visit again. But I always want there to be another one that I can, that has already written 20 books, and I can just, binge read all the way through them. But they're few and far between.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Joseph Selbie, thank you for adding your 10 best list to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations.
My pleasure to do so. And to readers everywhere, I just encourage them to keep doing it. It's always a joy.
Absolutely. What would we do without books? I don't
know.
I really don't know. I'd be out of a job. For sure, yeah. So The Physics of God and Break Through the Limits of the Brain, Joseph's 2 most recent books, are both published by New Page Books, a division of Redwill Weiser. And for more information about Joseph Selbie, his books and work, visit josephselbie.com and expandinglight.org. If you've enjoyed this particular episode, please go over to the No BS spiritualbookclub.com, and you can find, I think we're now up to over 100 episodes of some of your favorite authors and teachers and speakers sharing the stories behind their 10 best books. And while you're there, sign up for our Save My Space list, and we will let you know ahead of time whenever we've got an upcoming episode. And finally, if you feel you have a book in you but don't know how to begin getting it out of your head and into the hands of those who are waiting to read it, click on the Work With Me tab and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be just what you've been looking for. That's it for this week. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 Best interview. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you, Joseph Selbie.
My pleasure, and goodbye to all.